always want to say once in a while how much I appreciate everyone's attention to the study that we're having at this time, and of course any study that we do. And I really appreciate the feedback and the involvement, the participation with questions and comments and whatever we learn together as a family of Christians. And I've prepared some things, but I'm just one person, and any teacher is just one person. And so it's great to have a family of believers that studies together and learns together and can help each other grow in the Spirit and in truth. So that's our goal in any class we have here, or any sermon, any lesson that we have together. You all know, I think, we are in the middle of studying the book of Exodus, and we have left Egypt. God has taken or delivered the children of Israel out of Egypt on eagle's wings, as it's described, very quickly. Didn't even take 2 days. It took 1 day to get out of Dodge. So they are free and over across the Red Sea in Arabia, I believe, and right now in Mount Sinai, receiving the law from God on Mount Sinai. And Moses, of course, is the one who is a go-between here, one that God is dealing with directly. And get that mouse off of there. And we are in chapter 20, verses 1. We covered a couple subjects here last week. This is the beginning of the 10 Commandments. Start from verse 1 here, just to kind of give us a feeling for where we were. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You will have no other gods before me. And this is the first commandment we covered last week. And then the second one in verse 4, you shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in the heaven above, or in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. We talked about that. Let's see. The Lord being a jealous God, spend a little time on that. It's interesting to note that the word jealousy or jealousy is mostly applied to God in the Scriptures. You kind of would think that it would be applied to you and me and on the unrighteous way that we are jealous oftentimes for things that don't belong to us. We're jealous of other people's things. But with God, He is one who is due our love and worship. And when we give it to something else, He is jealous for that. He wants that for Him, because He is our God and loving Lord. And so we should treat Him the way that our God should be treated. So we covered that. Let's read this passage again here. He says, verse 5, you shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity or the sin of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. That's a tough statement. Visiting the iniquity. In other words, if you're, say today, you're set and determined not to love God and to do what's evil, well, then it's going to affect your children, and it's going to affect your children's children, and it's going to affect their children. This is what this is saying. Now, we know what it doesn't say. We can read over in Ezekiel 18, verse 20, that God only holds responsible those who sin, and those who do right, He holds them or gives them the credit for doing what's right. And this passage in Ezekiel 18:20 tells us that, so we know it's not talking about this. Let's just read that. Here in Ezekiel says, the soul who sins shall die. The son shall not bear the guilt of the father, nor the father bear the guilt of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself. So that's not what he's saying over here. What God is saying over here in chapter 20, verse 5 of Exodus. We all stand before God for what we do, and they were judged on that basis. But at the same time, you can't, think about Egypt right now. What condition is Egypt in right now? They're wasted. As even their leaders said that were what was the word that was actually used earlier, that they had been destroyed. And that's because of the decisions of the leaders and those heads of families that would not give in to the evidence of the plagues that God showed them. So they're suffering for that. You think their children are suffering for that too? Oh, sure. Will be for who knows how long till Egypt gets back up on its feet again, and their grandchildren. And so the consequences of sin, I believe mostly is what this is talking about, is something that God allows families and generations to suffer. And so, Kurt, you had your hand up, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got it. Here's a microphone.
Yeah, about this Ezekiel passage, this is one of the passages that tells us that the sin that the person is responsible for is something they actually commit, not something that's inherited. In other words, it goes against the idea that we're born in sin, but we're not. I mean, even Jesus himself, when he said, allow these children to come to me because the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. And if children were born sinners, Jesus wouldn't have said something like that. But this tells us that it's only upon those who actually commit the sin. It's something that's committed and not genetically inherited. There's another passage that talks about how, I don't have it in front of me, where sin spread to all men but here's the thing, because all sinned, something they actually did.
Yes.
I
Which
guess
is what this
inherently
is
have
saying
that,
too, right?
that bent towards committing the sin, but we're not guilty until it's committed. And if you think about it, a baby doesn't know any better. They don't know right from wrong. They can't be held accountable. So I just wanted to throw that argument out.
Yeah, appreciate that. So what's the lesson we need to learn? Oh, sorry, Lee, over here. Mike, up the front.
The word that in the translation you've got up there is translated as iniquity. In the translation that I've got is punishment.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I don't know about that. I'd have to look that up, what the difference is. Well, I'll come back next week with an answer to that one. Appreciate that. Another back here, Don, yes.
Yes, usually when you refer to that, you like Jeremiah, Ezekiel, listen to this, Deuteronomy, the law of
Second
God.
giving, yeah.
Yeah, Deuteronomy 24:16. Fathers shall not be put to death for their sons, nor shall sons be put to death for their fathers. Everyone shall be put to death for his own sin.
Yes.
But the Israelites didn't seem to follow that too well, because I can think of many times when both the parents as well as all the families were killed, right?
Yep. Very good.
But there's a lot of things that the Israelites didn't follow, like the year of Jubilee, for example. I don't think there's any record in the Gospels of them actually doing that,
Oh, of actually following that principle?
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
right.
and we'll come into that in just a little bit. We'll talk about.
Matter of fact, that's why they went. That's one of the reasons they went into exile so the land could celebrate its Sabbaths, right?
Right. Very good. Okay, now what was your point you made there? I'm carrying a few thoughts in my mind. Well, even in the context of where we are now, what happens in just a year or two when they actually leave Mount Sinai and they end up going up into the land of Canaan to conquer it, and they refuse the report of the spies that are sent in, and they revolt against that. And so what does God do? The punishment is what? Just the parents, though. The children didn't have to go 40 years, did they? Yes, well, yes, yeah, they did. No, the children are going to going into that land of Canaan, but who also had to wander around the desert of Arabia for 40 years? Everybody did. So, that's just the consequence of how life is. If you decide that you're going to be an alcoholic and that's going to be your life, do you think it's going to affect your kids? Huge thing. They may even become alcoholics. There's some statistics about that, how it affects that. It's more common for the child of an alcoholic to become an alcoholic than someone who doesn't have that practice. And just on and on you could go. If you decide that I'm going to make my living by robbing banks, is that going to hurt your family? Terribly so. So not sure, I think that's at least part of the application here, is that God doesn't spare families the trouble, the consequences of the sin of their parents. And so the moral of the story is what? Mom and dad, be good. Do what's right. Love God. Try to follow the scriptures, and your family, your children, and your children's children will be blessed because of it. In fact, it says in that last verse, but showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. Okay, so not an easy passage there, but it's one that's real life, and it's one that we want to make sure we don't fall into the same trap many of the Israelites, well, all of the Israelites did here in this particular time when they received the law and what followed after that. Okay, let's move ahead. Exodus 20, verse 7. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. There's a couple meanings of this word vain. It comes from the Hebrew word shavah and can mean vanity or uselessness, but also can mean false. It can mean something that doesn't produce the results you intended. So vain, false is a good full definition of the word. And Leviticus 19, verse 12, here you can see how it's used in this false way. Leviticus 19:12, and you shall not swear by my name falsely, nor shall you profane the name of the Lord your God. I am the Lord. So those that they were going to, if you're going to take an oath, you need to do it honestly and follow through and keep the oath that you gave, that you committed to. You can't, and to do otherwise would be to treat God in a way that was false and vanity. Now it's interesting, in the Old Testament, oaths are allowed. I don't believe they're not allowed today, but in the Old Testament they're specifically mentioned. Here in Deuteronomy 23 is a particular example. So if you're going to make an oath, you could just say, I promise. Or you could do something here. It says in verse 23, verse 1, when you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay to pay it. For the Lord your God will surely require it of you, and it will be sin to you. But if you abstain from vowing, it is not to be a sin to you. So you don't have to vow. But if you do take a vow and say, by the Lord God, I'm going to do this. You know, if you vow to the Lord or promise to God, that which has gone from your lips you shall keep and perform, for you voluntarily vow to the Lord your God what you have promised with your mouth. Okay, Teresa, over here. Did you have any? Yeah.
Okay, so today there's a very common phrase that goes around, OMG.
Oh, yes, of course.
And for me personally, that's using God's name in vain. It's frivolous. You're not praising him when you say that.
Yes, exactly.
So I would just like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a vain way. That's a terrible way to, I mean, that's not only vain, actually it's vain. So any kind of cursing like that, or making that kind of an expression, or using it as a swear word even, that people will do. I mean, is that honoring God? No, that's abasing him. That's treating him in a way that's completely, abominable. And so that certainly would be applying. And then, of course, also in the aspect of vows. Over here, Mike, let's see, are Don and Mike? Where are you, Mike? Where's the mic man? Oh, there he is. Was there somebody over here that had more to say? Sorry. Don and Mike over here on this side.
Yeah, that phrase, oh my God, right? Mm-hmm. You know that we say that, it's in the Bible, and we sing that, you know that? Oh my God.
Oh, sure.
I trust in thee. So it depends on how you
It
use
definitely
it, right?
does. Of course
it's
it
like
does.
it's like the same words can mean different things, like yeah, right, or yeah, right. Same words, two completely different meanings, right?
Yeah, it's not the word itself specifically, it's the intention,
It's your-
and
it's
the
your-
way you
it's your
use them, which
intent.
is what Teresa was saying here.
Right,
In a
exactly.
flippant way that's not respectful to God, that's a vain way, a false way to talk to him. Yeah, Mike?
So the early Jewish leaders tried to stop their people from taking the Lord's name in vain. As you know, the name of God in the Old Testament is Yahweh, most likely. Some people say Jehovah. But my point is this, that every time it said Yahweh, which is over 5,000 times, they took it out and they substituted the word Lord, so people couldn't take his name in vain. They didn't, after a while, people didn't even know how to spell Yahweh's name or how to pronounce it. But the deal is this: it doesn't matter if you have an accent, if you say his name in a foreign language, it's the intent of the heart that boils down to it. So the same with OMG. Those are just symbols that stand for God. And so it doesn't matter if you say OMG or you make up 3 letters of your own. It's the intent behind the heart. You know? And one more thing on that, since I'm on a bandwagon. Someone saw my preaching notes and a few years ago. And when I'm writing notes, I use real shorthand, just dashes and slashes, but also some words I use a couple letters for the word Christian. I use the word XN because the word Christian is a long word. And so someone told me that was sacrilegious. But how do you spell it in Spanish? How do you spell it in Greek? How do you spell it in Hebrew? It's different in every language. And written letters, all they are is symbols that express an idea. And so in no way was I trying to be sacrilegious, and I wasn't. I think that person just, anyway, I'm done. But I just pointed out that the letters still stand for something, and it's significant what they stand for.
Yes. Holding God's name in respect is something we need to do, and none of us, I think, would consider to do it otherwise. We hear it a lot around us, that when his name is not held high, but it's abused and it's just taken in a terrible way. And yeah, Mike over here.
Yeah. I heard someone preaching on this, and their understanding of this is a little different. He doesn't have here, you shall not speak the name of the Lord your God in vain, but you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. And essentially, that's what Israel was doing. They were being married to God. They were taking God's name. And he was telling them, don't wear his name in a vain way so as to make it appear null and void to the people around you. So he actually made it a broader thought there than what most people understand.
I see. Yeah, I don't know if I'd go that direction, but it's a possibility. I think it's how you use the name of your Lord, and especially I think in the context of when you're making promises and oaths, and that's what actually more of the scripture actually deals with, not so much swearing, but like we would do, or cursing, like we're talking about now. That I think also is something we need to avoid completely. But it's using God in your oath in a way that's vain or false. Kurt.
Yeah, I try to explain this to someone. I hate to belabor the point, but I try to explain it to someone, and they just pass off well, they weren't actually saying, the word or whatever. But it's what we call a euphemism. It still represents what's profane. Doesn't matter how you spell it or the initial, abbreviations. It doesn't matter. I mean, you wouldn't treat your parents in the same way. Let's say your father's name was Bill. You wouldn't say OMB. It's like, the people that do this know better, but to avoid the confrontation, try to like sugarcoat it and, say, well, it makes it sound bad, doesn't sound as bad, but it still represents the very thing that God told us not to do. And so I guess that's all I have to say about that.
Because hold it in respect.
I mean, I've been guilty of that myself, and I know better, but we try to justify it in our mind because it doesn't sound as bad, but we're still using God's name in vain when we try to sugarcoat it. So
I think so. Lee, over here with Lee. A workout for you, Mike.
I should get a bicycle out of this.
I know, you need the exercise.
With regard to what Mike was saying, that about a different way of taking the word take, certainly the Jews in Christ's time and earlier looked at this as the name itself was to be revered. And they did not look at it as the way they lived their life. It was the language they used was the interpretation that the Jews of Christ's time, at least, took for this particular word, this particular command.
Okay. There's an example in the New Testament here we'll look at next, and it's still the same subject here. Jesus, who is rebuking the Israelites, especially the leaders, I'm sure here, of using God's name and making oaths in a way that is not proper. I don't believe in this passage, you may disagree with me, that he's condemning all oaths, but he's condemning the abuse of them. And this is what Jesus says. Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord. And that's kind of what we're reading about right now, right? Is that if you're going to make an oath, then you should do it honestly and not do it falsely. But I say to you, do not swear at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by the earth, for it is his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Jews would swear by everything. You betcha I'm going to bring back that stuff that I borrowed by heaven's gate. Oh, just so many things they would say, that they would bind themselves on things and it was flippant. It didn't follow through, and it didn't have any meaning. So, nor shall you swear by your head, because you cannot make one hair white or black. But let your yes be yes, and your no, no. For whatever is more than these is from the evil one. Okay, just taking a moment to pause here. So, and I think we do that today. It's not a problem we have. We usually say yes or no. And we don't make this oath that was the Israelites were very, very common that they would make. And it was meaningless because they didn't honor it. And one more passage to look at to connect it with this, and we can have some more discussion. Matthew 23:16. Here he's talking to the blind guides, the Pharisees, and he says this about these oaths. He says, "Woe to you, blind guides who say, whoever swears by the temple, it is nothing. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obliged to perform it." Fools and blind. I mean, he's not done home punches here. He says, fools and blind. For which is greater, the gold of the temple that sanctifies the gold? The temple that sanctifies the gold? I'm sorry, wait a minute. For which is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctifies the gold? And of course, it's the temple that sanctifies the offering that's being given, the gold. Verse 18, and whoever swears by the altar, this is what they're saying, it is nothing. But whoever swears by the gift that is on it, he is obliged to perform it. So they're making these restrictions and okay, now you can get away with swearing by the altar and not keeping your oath, but you can't do that on the gift of the altar because that's more important in their minds, or that was more special. He says, fools and blind, for which is greater, the gift of the altar the gift or the altar that sanctifies the gift. Therefore, he who swears by the altar swears by it and by all things on it. He who swears by the temple swears by it and by him who dwells in it. And he who swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits on it. So this shows part of their problem they had, which was just pervasive. They would swear by these things, make oaths, and not keep them because they'd made up this little system of what was really important. And Jesus says, not at all. You know, if you're going to swear by anything or make an oath by anything that's connected to God, you better keep it. But the general principle is, let's just say yes, and let's just say no, okay? And we'll stay out of trouble that way. We won't get into and that's why people ask the question, well, what about when you're in a court? And I don't think they do it anymore, but they put your hand on the Bible. And do they do that in court still? Okay, yeah, make an oath by the Bible. I don't believe that's wrong to do. You do it very rarely, and obviously if you're going to be honest about your oath, but it's the abuse of it that Jesus was saying here, because it was authorized under the Old Covenant, but they had abused it greatly, and so it was meaningless. And of course, in the middle of it, the greatest problem was they were taking God's name in vain. That was the biggest problem. Okay, moving on to the next one, if we're good. Verse 8, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work. You, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who's within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. And so we can see they had problems keeping this command continually, and they would try to get around it every which way they could, even making up things like, well, how far can you walk on the Sabbath day? Well, and they made up a thing, well, you can walk 5/8 of a mile on the Sabbath day. That was a Sabbath mile, they would call it. So they had all these things just so they can kind of manipulate and use what God had made for their benefit, to use it to get around certain things that they wanted to do. So, pretty clear what this is saying. Don't work on the Sabbath. Enjoy the Sabbath. Enjoy your rest. And the reason he gives here is because I made the world in 6 days and I rested on the seventh, which in the mind of many people would make this a universal command for all time. But we look a little deeper and we'll see that really that's not the case at all. It was a command to the children of Israel, the Israelites. Don, got a hand up?
Yeah, you're probably going to cover this, but it goes a little more into detail than Deuteronomy chapter 5.
Hold on for a minute.
Right?
We're going to go there
Yeah.
pretty quick.
I figured you would go there.
I figured you'd be ahead of me. First, though, let's notice this, that before we look at that, so the principle we're going to see is that we're no longer under the Sabbath day law. Well, we could have been if God wanted it to last that long, but or if it was repeated for our practice in the New Testament, like every other of the Ten Commandments is repeated or in some way. But notice this too. Remember that the Sabbath day requirement was not given until God delivered Israel out of Egypt. Even though he gives this as a reason here, that the reason I'm giving it to you is because I made the earth in 6 days and rested on the seventh. This is the first mention of it. Previously, I mean, right after their Exodus, they started the Sabbath command. If you remember, when we went back just a month or so before this, they started doing that. Before that, Abraham didn't keep a Sabbath. We read about it. Jacob didn't. Nobody did. Of God's people, nobody really did. So this is the first time you hear about it. And you would think if it was to be a universal thing, it would probably be started before now. But it's not. So, and then let's go to what Don was saying. We have something more specific as far as, or in addition to another motive or reason, purpose for keeping the Sabbath. And we read about that in a few places, but here's one clear place in Deuteronomy 5, beginning verse 13. Here, this law, the Deuteronomy is the second giving of the law, the second revealing of the law. That's what that book is about. And here it says, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you nor your son, nor your daughter, we've just read this, right? Male servant, nor your female servant, nor your ox, nor your donkey, nor any of your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates, that your male servant and female servant may rest as well as you, even your animals. And remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. So this is a secondary reason for the Sabbath. It was for the Jews who were delivered out of Egypt to remember that event, that they labored and without a Sabbath. I'm sure they didn't have a Sabbath before then. They likely labored every day, don't know for sure. But now I've rescued you out here and I'm giving you this day, and so you can remember my deliverance, that I delivered you. So, who here is related to somebody that was delivered out of the Egyptian bondage? Maybe there are people who are Israelites related here. But the thing is, most of us are not. Pardon me? Not spiritually. Physically, talking about. So yeah, this was for the Israelites. This is not for, in God's kingdom, for those that are chosen by faith through Christ. This particular command to keep that Sabbath day and to rest on it was given to those who were delivered out of the land of Egypt and their posterity, their descendants. Okay. One other passage in the New Testament, Colossians 2, verse 16, verse 17, as he's dealing with some of teachers who are trying to bring things in and change the law and bind the Old Testament. I think that was part of the problem. And he says in chapter 2, verse 16 and 17, so let no one judge you in food or in drink or regarding a festival, which they had, with the Old Testament laws here we'll read about, or a new moon or Sabbaths, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substance is of Christ. So if someone comes along and says to you, look, you should be keeping the Sabbath day like it's commanded in the 10 Commandments. Well, the answer is, well, it wasn't given to me to begin with. And Paul directly says, look, Sabbaths are no longer something that we observe like they did during the time of the Jewish nation, when they were God's chosen people. So, but again, like I say, oh, I'm sorry, I can't see. You're back there in the dark, Bill. Turn a light on, maybe. Bill's got a question. Or a
I'm going to buy you some binoculars.
You need to have a light or something, or you can flash at me.
There's Acts 20:7 says, on the first day of the week when we came together to break bread. There's an approved apostolic example that supersedes the Sabbath day, because on the first day of the week they met, not on the seventh day, not on the Sabbath.
Yeah.
And furthermore, if someone tells you you have to keep the Sabbath, oh, by the way, there's 612 other laws you also have to keep, because if you keep one, you got to keep them all.
Yeah, and we dealt with that a little bit earlier about the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, the 10 Commandments no longer binding on us in the New Testament, been replaced, superseded, and of course, the Sabbath day is one of those. But we wanted to go a little extra on that, because some people will say, well, this is the one command that actually does cross over into the New Testament, when really, no, it doesn't. So, somebody else have a hand up? Over here, Mike, Don's got a comment to make.
Suppose that I was firmly convicted that I should not work on, say, Saturday, or Friday sundown to Saturday sundown. But I don't bind that on anybody else. But I feel very convicted. Would you put me down? Would you say I was doing wrong if I kept that? Going along with what it says in Colossians 2:16 and 17, that you shouldn't judge anybody on their convictions of anything that's in the law, as long as they don't say that you need to do that for your own salvation.
Yeah, I think Romans 14 is a good place to go to talk about liberty of people keeping one day above another. It talks very specifically about that. I mean, if there's somebody who keeps one day above another, and there's some people who just treat every day the same, that's fine. You do what you want. You can keep Tuesday, for that matter, if you like to, every week, and say, I have this, whatever, or Saturday. Maybe just because I like to think about the old law. So, well, go ahead and do that. Now, when you get up here, though, or talk to these people and say, well, what we need to be doing to please God is to keep the Sabbath day like they did back here in the time of Moses, we're going to have a problem then because, yeah. So, yeah, Romans 14, good study about the liberties that we have. And as far as keeping days or eating meats of certain kind, you know, whatever that is, God gives those freely for us to enjoy. So, yeah, I would say that I don't think another practice that would see here we get a circumcision. Paul talks about circumcision. If you believe you're to be justified by circumcision, then you have severed from Christ, fallen from grace. That's if you are practicing it to be, as you believe to be a requirement before God, and of course teaching others to do the same. And yet, plenty of us here probably in our day and age that are circumcised, but aren't for religious reasons. And so there's a difference there. So yeah, it depends on the context, what you're saying. If you're saying, okay, this is something I have to do to be saved, then no. Mike.
So I didn't raise to answer Don's question, but if I knew that about Don, since he's open and he's a good Bible student, I'd probably say, well, share with me why you're doing that. And I'd say, well, have you thought about this or that? And I would acknowledge his right to make the final decision, but I'd probably chat with him. But on to the point I raised my hand about, it's a long time since I've had an opportunity to study with a Seventh-day Adventist, probably 10 or 15 years. But if I got to again, what I would want to know is this, that, you know, are they keeping the whole Sabbath law? Because when you broke the Sabbath,
What happened?
you died.
That's right.
If you had a mule that was, or an ox that was plowing, or whatever, if you making a fire, you were put to death. And so I'd like to know their take on that, because they have one, and they don't put people to death, but they're not keeping the Sabbath day law that Moses was given.
Right. Yeah, I would agree with you. If Don had that position, which I don't believe Don has, I would say, look, I think you're not seeing this correctly. But if he insisted, I'm going to do it, I would let him do it. It wouldn't be something that would be a fellowship issue, I don't think. Okay, got some more stuff. Mike first over here, and then as Mike's coming over to, Kurt's got a question or a comment too. Brother Franklin.
So for someone to say, well, I'm going to just, use the Sabbath day to reflect upon, God's command, and I'm going to do that, on my own. I think that some may have touched on this, but once you begin to observe any aspect of the law, it's not like you can go in there and say, God, I like this part of the law, therefore I'm going to keep it. Once you observe any aspect of the law and you observe it is good, and that you're going to be justified by that practice, then you need to observe the whole law. That's what James teaches us. And so, there would definitely be a problem.
That'd be sticky there, yeah. If maybe if Don said, I'm just going to do it as a tradition, but not because I think it's something I'm going to be saved by. Tradition. We basically have a tradition where we don't work at our employment on Saturday. Is that okay?
Well, that's fine, but a person who might make that
or do you need to work on Saturday? Are you saying you need to work on Saturday?
Well, maybe you do.
Maybe you do.
But if you had a job that did require you to work on Saturday, and you said, well, I have a religious observance of the Sabbath, then you would need to, for them, sometimes they'll say, okay, well, where does your religion teach that? Well, a Christian honestly couldn't make that claim that it was something that God, through Christ, would have us do.
Yeah, good point.
And I think it would be something that you really wouldn't.
Every other one of these commandments, we see that it's repeated in some form or other in the New Testament. The Sabbath is not. So yeah, we'd have to. I got that point. I see that. Maybe you're right about that, Kurt.
Yeah, I remember when I was in the martial arts, one of the students didn't come to class on Saturdays because it's of religious observance. I should have told them that we don't have to do anything, just stand there and I'll do all the work, you know? But I was looking at the context of Colossians 2, and it looks like, you know, God is correcting some of these errors, like, you know, holding to circumcision, and it says in, he made a public display of them, having triumphed over them through him. Therefore, no one is to act as your judge in regard to food or drink, or, you know. So I'm wondering, is basically God saying, talking about people who do observe the Sabbath, who are now judging the you, which is us, who don't observe the Sabbath, you know? So, but we are told to correct others. I mean, that's what the Word of God is for. It's for correction, for training in righteousness, and all those things. So, I don't know if you can twist around the other way, but I see it as like, it's okay for us to correct people or to teach them or to guide them along the way. But here it looks like he's actually saying, don't let those people who observe the Sabbath judge you for doing what's right, because the substance is of Christ, not Moses or anything
Amen.
else. So.
And, you know, to be fair, too, on that, so I'm not sure exactly how you guys got asked some pretty tough questions sometimes. It's clear that if you advocate circumcision for salvation, that you're severed, it says there. So it may be also that if you're advocating or practicing keeping the Sabbath day to please God, you could be severed from Christ, even though it doesn't mention that one. But you are doing the same thing. You're going back to the old covenant, even though circumcision preceded the old covenant, but the giving of a law. It was still part of the Old Testament and that law. So
As Gentiles,
Mike?
we weren't, as Gentiles,
I think Florento has a comment. He likes to make his at 20 after. Go.
We, of course, we're no longer under the Sabbath law. But it's very important to notice that to remember the Sabbath day and to keep it holy. But the most important thing in that verse, I would believe, is where the Lord said, therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. That's one of the most pronounced commandment from God, for it simply means that he really favored that in a way. Because when he said, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it, no matter that we're no longer under the Sabbath law, the blessing of the Lord would still go on.
Yeah, I don't think it
If you
does.
perceive.
That's okay. Not for that reason. The blessing of the Lord certainly does go on, but he had this particular command, my understanding is, for particular people at a particular time, and it wasn't given to the Gentiles. It wasn't given to people that didn't come out of the land of Egypt. For them, he blessed it.
Of course, we're no longer under the Sabbath law.
Yeah.
But the Lord said, bless the Sabbath day. It's not the Sabbath law.
Well, okay.
That itself will never
It is one of the
change.
commandments in the 10 Commandments. So it is a law. And so we have to make the decision, do we need to follow that law to be acceptable to God? And my understanding is, whether it's talking about any of the other commands that we're going to read in just a bit, about that have a lot of different commands that follow the 10 Commandments, whether we need to follow that or not. Okay, appreciate that, Florento. All right, we're done. 20 after. Got 10 minutes. Get back here. Not sure where you go, but anyway. Don't leave. Don't leave. Thank you.